Thank you so much, Stephen. It's a treat to be here tonight. I've already seen a lot of old faces. Not that they're old, but people I haven't seen in a long time is what I mean to say. And it's wonderful to help the Eliot Society launch its very important work. In that resume of my career, Stephen didn't mention that my family began attending Wallace Presbyterian Church in 1962, which is, in case you're trying to do the math in a hurry, almost 55 years now. I was all of 9 years old, so this is kind of like a homecoming, although this is only the second time I've been in this building. Used to be in a building in Hyattsville, where I spent many, I think I still have dreams about places in that building. I attended Wallace from then until my wife and I moved to Philadelphia for me to attend seminary in 1977. In the course of that time, I was baptized and married within the bosom of Wallace. After seminary, when we moved back to the area, I was ordained as an elder. We were in that congregation until we once again moved to Philadelphia in 1984. And my parents were here for many years. My sister now spends a number of hours each week attending to all of the administrivia that is part of church life. So this really is a homecoming for me. It was while I was here at Wallace, during my college years at Maryland, that I first began thinking seriously about faith and the arts, which is the focus of the Eliot Society's mission. And that thinking began because of my early involvement with music. It may have also begun because of the fact that my parents came from a Christian tradition that didn't support Christians actually attending movies. And when we became Presbyterians, one of the perks was we got to go to movies. So I may have been thinking then about questions about Christians and the arts because of that. But again, I'd been involved in church music and in music in schools, and then ended up majoring in film studies, as Stephen mentioned. And I was very curious about the kinds of things that Liz Horst mentioned. Why is it that there's a kind of antagonism? What happened to the world of the arts and what happened to the church's life to create a condition of a kind of simmering antagonism between the world of faith and the world of the arts? So I've spent a good deal of my adult life trying to understand the origins of that tension. And that the work that I do with Mars Hill Audio addresses culture more broadly defined, but it's really my concern about how Christians engage the arts and how the arts reflect broader cultural trends that's at the heart of the work I've been doing with Mars Hill for 25 years. And those are the questions that matter to me most, so I was really happy to accept the invitation to be here tonight. When I was at Maryland between 1970 and 1974, there was a small Christian bookstore over on Knox Road. I think there's a bar in that space now called The Lamplighter. Some of you may remember The Lamplighter. And it's where I spent many hours and many dollars beginning to piece together an understanding of theology and a theological understanding of culture. And it was there where I bought this book, a collection of essays by Dorothy L. Sayers called Christian Letters to a Post-Christian World. It was published in 1969. And it was a relatively new book when I bought it. It's actually stayed in pretty good shape here. I know it was bought then because I can tell by the orthography, I can tell the quality of my signature. I know what I wrote like in there. But also it cost $3.95, and you couldn't buy a book like that for $3.95. It was a remarkably distinctive book at the time because there were very few books available that combined a conservative theological viewpoint with a concern for the arts. And I owned every one of them. I really was hungry for that. And the guy who managed the store at that time would always tell me when I'd go in that there was a new book that I should be aware of. Now, not all the essays in this book are concerned with the arts, but it does include an essay originally published in 1947 called Towards a Christian Aesthetic. And that preposition at the beginning of that title, towards, is very important because, as Sayers asserted at the beginning of the essay, quote, "We have no Christian aesthetic, no Christian philosophy of the arts. The church as a body has never made up her mind about the arts. And it is hardly too much to say that she has never tried. She has, of course, from time to time, puritanically denounced the arts, as irreligious and mischievous, or tried to exploit the arts as a means of teaching religion and morals, but I shall hope to show you that both these attitudes are false and degrading, and are founded upon a completely mistaken idea of what art is supposed to be and do, close quote. Now, I must have read that in my late teens originally, and I'm sure it rang true to me at the time. At the time, in the world of American evangelicalism, it seemed that the arts were treated with indifference, suspicion, or hostility. And at the time, I thought this was a problem with the anti-intellectualism and the general, if you pardon my saying this, Philistinism of evangelicalism. That's what I thought at the time. I was a harsh young man. Evangelicals hadn't really matured much culturally from their fundamentalist roots. I think it was H.L. Mencken who referred to fundamentalists as the great bourgeoisie. Only later did I realize that the connections between faith and the arts suffered from much deeper and older fractures, the product of a radical secularization in modern societies that for centuries tended to separate cultural life from the influence of faith and of theology. Sayers actually alludes to that segregation in that 1947 essay. I didn't appreciate at the time the historical background to what she was saying. She wrote, "So far as European aesthetic is concerned, one feels that it would probably have developed along precisely the same lines had there never been an incarnation to reveal the nature of God, that is to say, the nature of all truth." That's fantastic. If we commit ourselves to saying that the Christian revelation discovers to us the nature of all truth, then it must discover to us the nature of the truth about art, among other things. And she went on to say, "I will go so far as to maintain that the extraordinary confusion of our minds about the nature and function of art is principally due to the fact that for nearly 2,000 years, we have been trying to reconcile a pagan, or at any rate, a Unitarian aesthetic with a Christian, that is, Trinitarian and incarnational theology. Even that makes us too intelligent. We have not tried to reconcile them. We have merely allowed them to exist side by side in our minds. And where the conflict between them became too noisy to be overlooked, we've tried to silence the clamor by force, either by brutally subjugating art to religion or by shutting them up in separate prison cells and forbidding them to hold any communication with one another." I reread that as I was preparing this talk, and I was struck by this compartmentalization metaphor that she uses, when I think that does ring true, and it rings true to what I now understand about the history of modern culture. The claim that Christian thinking about art and about creativity and imagination more generally has not taken seriously enough the Trinity and the Incarnation, or I might add, the resurrection and Pentecost, is one that I encountered much later in various theologians, including the work of Colin Gunton, who I'll quote a number of times. Gunton is the one who introduced me to the idea that much thinking about culture in general was effectively Unitarian, that when we think about creation and culture, we tend to think about God the Father without including the second and third persons of the Trinity. And I think that creates the kind of weakness that Dorothy L. Sayers was getting to. The consequences of this theological gap were exacerbated historically by a dualism that separated church and culture, a dualism entrenched not just in the thinking, but in the institutions of modern culture. Not long ago, I read an essay from the mid-1990s called "Sing Artistically for God: Biblical Directives for Church Music," written by Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Pope Benedict XVI. In that essay, Ratzinger urged Christians to assess soberly the consequences of the segregation of a richly Trinitarian, Christocentric faith from the life of culture. He wrote, "The interconnection of faith to culture is in the throes of a crisis. Since the end of the Enlightenment, faith and contemporary culture have drifted apart more and more. Up to that time, culture had developed from the roots of religion in Christian Europe, as in all history, and had remained tied to this matrix even in its secular forms of expression. The Renaissance and the Reformation marked a first crisis for this blending of church and culture, but not until the Enlightenment does a real cultural revolution, a decisive emancipation of culture from faith, occur. The two go their separate ways. All in all, the gap has become wider and wider, and in the confusing conflict between the cultural experiments and cultureless, pragmatic activities of the church, today it is obvious that we are at a loss as to how faith can and should express itself culturally in the present age, close quote. Faith, Ratzinger insisted, must express itself culturally. It must take cultural form. But not all forms are consonant with or capable of sustaining the significance of a ramified faith, a faith that has consequences in history and in the material world. Ratzinger was concerned that the church shouldn't appropriate cultural experiments, as he calls them, which I think are typically aimless and groundless expressions of sheer will, gestures of a culture decidedly divorced from faith. In other words, not all forms of artistic expression can be adapted for constructive use within the life of the church. They've been formed to serve another purpose. Aesthetic styles, for instance, that evolved to accentuate the inevitability of violence, or the priority of freedom over truth, or forms that celebrate arrogant rebellion. And these passions, these dispositions, take aesthetic form. They can't really promote the humility and love that's necessary for a real encounter with beauty. So when the church adopts forms that have been developed apart from faith, the church actually ends up, as he says, practicing a kind of pragmatic adaptation that actually works against the interests of the church. Secularized societies have cultivated forms that manifest and amplify waywardness and autonomy. Churches, meanwhile, as Ratzinger said, tend to pursue cultureless, pragmatic activities. And I'll confess that my work as a theological journalist, if that's what my job title is, began at about the same time the church growth movement began, which was adopting all sorts of marketing techniques and other cultural forms in order to sustain market share for Christians. I would regard these as pragmatic activities that are inattentive to the meaning of cultural forms. They're programs that have some success in attracting non-believers whose imaginations have already been shaped by a secularized culture. The success that these activities enjoy is precisely a function of their being superficially Christian. They present the gospel as a simple amendment to a way of life that has already been determined by forces that are indifferent or hostile to the gospel, rather than calling for a radical transformation of mind and embodied action. Ratzinger's point here and elsewhere is that for some time in the West, a faithless culture and a cultureless faith have grown up together, with the result that Christians can no more imagine cultural forms that are the incarnations of faithfulness than can their unbelieving neighbors. Confronting that crisis requires Christians to acknowledge the extent to which their own imaginations have been formed by secularized institutions, practices, and artifacts. Our imaginations are more worldly than we realize, and our faith is sadly too worldless. That is, our faith has little to say about life in the world of space and time, or the experience of the world of the senses. It might be adequate to call modern culture Gnostic, not just secularized. Modern culture celebrates the body, apparently, and living in the material world by detaching it from the spiritual world. And so, as one of your neighbors, D.C. Schindler, observes, Dr. Schindler teaches at Catholic U and lives, I think, over in Hyattsville. Quote, "We often hear that modernity, with its this-worldly religion, is the first epoch in the history of the West to come to terms with the body and make peace with the flesh," close quote. And yet, the modern insistence that the life of the body has no necessary spiritual meaning, and hence that aesthetic forms organizing our sensory experience have no real meaning intrinsically, is actually quite demeaning to physicality and to life in the body. And so Schindler argues that, quote, what looks superficially like peace and a respect for the world of the senses arises in fact from a contempt that runs so deep it has grown cold to the point of indifference. The life of the senses can now be enjoyed in detachment, or conversely, the senses can be dispassionately exploited, ultimately because sense experience doesn't mean anything in itself. In this case, imagination becomes simply trivial, and so too does the natural world that the imagination mediates. The imagination is, or he's saying by contrast, the imagination should be understood as where the world can have a sort of spiritual home in us, and for that same reason is what allows us to have a home in the world. And Schindler concludes that the recovery of a genuine Christian culture, as Eliot imagined, requires a recovery of beauty in its theological, metaphysical, and ultimately even its physical significance. Anything less will no doubt unwittingly trivialize precisely what it seeks to restore, close quote. The recovery of beauty that Schindler advocates here, a recovery that requires the cultivation of Christian imaginations that are faithful to the reality of beauty, is a concern of a great many theologians in the past 50 years. So the negligence that Dorothy L. Sayers lamented in the 1940s, that I first read about in the 1970s, has been addressed, at least by many scholars, if not within the everyday life of believers and of the church. I fear that the arts, like many other cultural pursuits, are still, within the church, victims of a utilitarian approach to culture, sweetened ever so ineffectually by what Christian Smith has labeled moralistic therapeutic deism. That's a claim I won't defend tonight. Suffice it to say that a recovery of beauty and of Christian imagination will require a deliberate renouncing of a worldly host of dualisms that characterize modern culture and much of the modern church's life. The dualisms I have in mind assume a division between things that may properly be distinguished from one another, but shouldn't be thought of as separate or polarized, sacred and secular, body and soul, reason and imagination, form and content, freedom and obedience, church and culture, even, dare I say it, scripture and tradition and heaven and earth. The radical severing asunder of these various partners is part of the Enlightenment's misguided project, a project to which, unfortunately, the modern church often assented far too much. Our nation was founded in the wake of and on the foundation of various Enlightenment ideas, so we shouldn't be surprised that American culture was deeply informed by Enlightenment suspicions both about the segregation of faith and culture and about the possibilities of artistic expression to connect us with transcendent reality. Art critic Robert Hughes, who was a native Australian but before his death in 2012 was long an American resident and was art critic for Time magazine, years ago wrote a wonderful history of American art called American Visions. He didn't address the philosophical and theological questions I've been mentioning directly, but he does talk a lot about how both Puritan and Enlightenment ideas shaped an understanding of the possibilities for American distinctiveness and an understanding of national purpose, which was truly modern and which left the European cultural tradition behind, including, I think, its artistic tradition. As Hughes writes there, American republicanism, quote, did not toss out the Puritan heritage. It enlarged it, though with transfusions from the secular Enlightenment. Just as the Puritans had imagined themselves transcending the corruptions of old Europe in creating their city on the hill, so the patriots of the Revolution would create a society where tyranny, blood aristocracy, and monarchy would be no more, and their cultural results, effeteness and luxury, would be unknown. This was a tall order. What role could the arts play in such a republic? Americans sharply disagreed on the answer, and their disagreements continue more than 200 years later. Some thought the arts, being signs of luxury, were intrinsically corrupting, and that there was no place for them in America, even, and perhaps especially, if they served the state. For how could a good message be delivered by a bad messenger? But the more common view was that art could be useful as long as it embodied virtue, held up examples of worthy behavior, armed republicans with zeal. But were they not too costly for a young republic? Thomas Jefferson thought so. Painting, this is a quote from Jefferson, painting, statuary, too expensive for the state of wealth among us. End of discussion. He wrote that in a note to some friends who were about to go to Europe in 1788. His note went on, "It would be useless, therefore, and preposterous for us to make ourselves connoisseurs in these arts. They are worth seeing, but not studying." My friends in Charlottesville don't like to hear this about their patron saint. The art he wished to foster was architecture. Not a bad idea. Benjamin Franklin, meanwhile, saw no point in importing art from Italy. During his Italian visit, he really wished America could get hold of the recipe for Parmesan cheese, however. If there was a place for art in America, it was moral rather than metaphysical. It could serve to encourage good behavior by offering paintings and statuary and buildings and stories that honored moral rectitude. Pennsylvania-born Benjamin West, a painter who spent all of his life after the age of 22 in Europe, but who nevertheless felt a cultural link with his native land, believed that the proper job of artists was, quote, to instruct the rising generation in honorable and virtuous deeds. This moral task seems rather tepid in contrast to the grandeur, the cosmic metaphysical vision that informed the work of artists such as Dante and Michelangelo, Bach, and Shakespeare. But if moral instruction was the highest purpose of art, there were probably cheaper and safer ways to accomplish it. This moralistic approach treated art in a utilitarian way, an attitude that continues to the present whenever, for example, engagement with the arts is credited for improving test scores on standardized tests or for encouraging intercultural understanding. In the mid-19th century, when Alexis de Tocqueville visited America, he soon saw that this new democracy seemed much more indifferent to the fine arts than was his native France. Yeah. He suggested that democracy actually contributed to this disinterest. Quote, "Democratic nations cultivate the arts that serve to render life convenient." It's what Jefferson called the useful arts. In preference, Tocqueville went on, in preference to those whose object is to embellish it, they would habitually refer the useful to the beautiful. Note Tocqueville suggests a divide between the useful and the beautiful, or rather recognized an American assumption about a divide between the useful and the beautiful. Useful referring to life in the body, life in space and time, how we get along in temporal things. Life bounded by material concerns. Beauty, on the other hand, isn't useful because it doesn't seem to have anything to do with the practical matter of getting on in life. George Parkin Grant, a Canadian philosopher who died in 1988, was very sensitive to this pitting of the useful and practical against the beautiful and the transcendent. And he wondered whether American culture hadn't long tended to perceive the world simply as raw material, as natural resources with which we can do whatever we want to. Perhaps, he wrote, we are lacking the recognition that our response to the whole world should not most deeply be that of doing, and I would add, of doing something with it, but that of wondering and marveling at what is, being amazed or astonished by it, or perhaps best, in a discarded English usage, admiring it. Grant went on to argue that it's only when we've perceived creation in all of its beautiful and astonishing meaningfulness, in all of its mysterious givenness and its endowed capacities, that we could properly and reverently consider how we might use it, or rather, how we might be good and worthy stewards of it. Now, I should say at this point that this utilitarian spirit is not just a function of people who have a practical bent. It's not just that we had more Marthas than Marys settle here. There were also deep philosophical assumptions which eventually became entrenched in modern science and its supporting institutions that segregated utility and beauty. In assessing the development of certain central modern ideas, theologian Colin Gunton described the establishment of what he called a firm line of demarcation between different kinds of reality. On one side of the line was the material world, the object of the senses, and the realm of impermanence and unreliability. And by the way, I should say this is a prejudice that is an ancient prejudice. He sees this in some ancient Greek thought. On the other side of this line was the intelligible world, that which was understood by thought, and accordingly the realm of permanence and reliability. This dualistic framework that separated mind from matter does have its predecessors in ancient Greek thought, particularly, I think, in Gnosticism, but its modern form was pioneered by Galileo and developed most thoroughly by René Descartes. It became institutionalized in what came to be called the two-substance theory. According to this framework of understanding, every physical thing in the universe has two sets of qualities. It has primary qualities, which are things that are measurable and quantifiable. And then these primary qualities were qualities, actual properties of the things themselves. So this lectern, I could measure it, I could weigh it, I could check the density of the wood, I could find all sorts of measurable things. Those are its primary qualities. But then there were secondary qualities, things like light and color and smell and sound, which Galileo and Descartes and subsequent thinkers regarded as purely subjective, the effects of appearances to the senses that are falsely projected back into nature by the human mind. They're properties of the mind, not of the world itself. Cultural historian Franklin Baumer summarized this division of the world into two great realms of mind and matter this way. He said, mind was ejected from nature, so were all the qualities that had formerly kept nature close to man, the fragrance of flowers, the songs of birds, the color in everything, including light itself. Mind, soul, purpose belonged to man's interior world, but not to nature. Nature, it now appeared, was like a great machine or clock made of dead matter, possessing fundamentally mathematical characteristics, functioning mechanistically rather than teleologically. That is, it didn't have a purpose. It didn't have an end that gave it its manner of working. It was obedient to invariable natural laws, and this dualism allowed scientists to pursue their inquiries without paying much more than passing attention to theology and metaphysics. This is the beginning of a division between science and faith also. Baumer concludes, with the elimination of the secondary qualities, basically saying things like color and light and smell, all the things that we like, that we perceive with our senses, nature inevitably began to seem less like a setting for man's spiritual pilgrimage and more like a field for the exercise of human power. But where this was understood, it prompted on the whole more optimism than pessimism. Hey, we can now make nature do what we want to. And this is the beginning of the idea. Prior to this, the idea that there's a war on nature, or we're trying to beat nature, it just isn't part of the Western imagination. This optimism promoted, the optimism this theory promoted was a result of the possibility of controlling nature. But there was an accompanying pessimism. Because with the possibility of increased control came a sense of decreased meaning. Physicist Steven Weinberg puts it this way in his book, The First 3 Minutes. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. But of course, he's defining comprehensibility in terms of control. What can we do to control things? Pre-modern men and women lived in a world that was threatening and baffling, but it was full of purpose and meaning, however obscure and mysterious. Purpose and meaning that was often conveyed in imaginative ways through the stuff of creation. Modern men and women live in a world that is meaningless, in which the cosmic and metaphysical significance of the material world is denied, but the world is more and more manageable, more and more controllable, more subjected to our wills through technology. So modernity bargains away meaning for power. C.S. Lewis commented on this regression in an essay of his called The Empty Universe. At the outset, the universe appears packed with will, intelligence, life, and positive qualities. But the advance of knowledge gradually empties this rich and genial universe, first of its gods, then of its colors, smells, sounds, and tastes, that is the secondary qualities, finally of solidity itself, as solidity was imagined. The same method which has emptied the world now proceeds to empty ourselves. The masters of the method soon announced that we were just as mistaken, and mistaken in much the same way, when we attributed souls or selves or minds to human organisms as when we attributed dryads to the trees. This relentless tendency toward reductionism, where we are just, as some cyberpunk author put it, meat and wetware. That the idea that we have mind or self is actually just an illusion of the biochemistry. Modern science and the philosophies that accompany it establish a division between the natural world, the world of manipulable matter, and the human world, the world of ideas and values, and spiritual aspiration. And one of the effects of this division was to raise questions about whether the world of the senses could reliably present us with intelligible meaning. And that in turn raises questions about whether works of art could truthfully connect us with objective reality, or whether art merely connects us with ourselves, with the reality of our own inner life. Of course, art didn't go away. In the dualistic world of modernity, in which matter and mind and utility and beauty are severed, art is still possible and sometimes felt to be desperately necessary. The 20th century literary critic Northrop Frye describes imagination as the effort to bridge these two worlds. Frye suggested that the joy we experience in art, and particularly he's interested in the evocative experience of a wonderful poetic metaphor, is a delight at having overcome the alienation of the mind from the material world. But finally, he seems to suggest that the bridging of the gap is illusory. It's an illusion. The knowledge conveyed by the imagination, which suggests that there is a continuity between our minds and the world of the senses, well, that's just an imaginary link. It's very pleasant. But art becomes an escape from a meaningless reality rather than a delightful, informing celebration of a deeply meaningful reality. Art's power, according to Frye, I think, as if I'm reading him correct, is finally a delusion, since there really is nothing to escape to. I'd argue that the experience of art, the sense that we have of significance and connection and meaning conveyed through artistic expression, is not an illusory or escapist exercise. It is, in fact, a return to reality. Dana Gioia, who served as chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts during the George W. Bush administration, once observed, and I think this quote is on the Eliot Society webpage, if I'm not mistaken, "Art is a distinct and irreplaceable way of knowing the world because it alone, unlike science or philosophy, uses and engages the fullness of our humanity." Notice, it's of knowing the world. Art addresses our intellect, our senses, our emotions, our imagination, our intuition, our memory, and our physical body, not separately but together, simultaneously, holistically. In other words, art demonstrates, I would argue, the coherence of these diverse aspects of our humanity, as well as the coherence and intelligibility of the creation in which we live. Dorothy L. Sayers was right to condemn the development of an aesthetic as if the incarnation never happened. Because the belief that God took on human form, that, as St. Paul put it, the whole fullness of the deity was embodied, stands as a fundamental rebuke to the dualisms I've been discussing. And I think it's the incarnation that should be a central idea for our assessment about the possibilities of art. In the same letter to the Colossians, in which St. Paul asserts the union of the divine and the human in Jesus Christ, he also writes that by Christ all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So Paul links the Christian understanding of creation with the idea of the incarnation. Colin Gunton, once again, has observed that this link of the incarnation with the creation has wonderful consequences for our beliefs about the intelligibility and meaningfulness of creation. a world that owes its origin to a God who makes it with direct reference to one who was to become incarnate. Let me pause there for a minute so you can take that in. Everything is made in light of Christ. Everything in creation has a Christocentric reality, which means that all of creation is made with the incarnation in mind, as it were, part of the creation. That is a world, Gunton goes on to say, that is a world that has a proper place for human beings to use their senses, minds, and imaginations, and to expect that they will not be wholly deceived in doing so. In other words, we're not created in the image of a unitarian, purely spiritual God. We're created in the image of the one who became flesh, who entered his own creation and felt it and talked about it from the inside. This is why the incarnation is so important to a Christian understanding of imagination. It doesn't just set an example for us to make things. It establishes a continuity between us, God, and the world that we inhabit. And it's on the basis of that continuity that both reason and imagination can properly and confidently take up with the world, and that the knowledge we acquire by the world about the world doesn't have to be pure geometry or physics to be valid. The atoning work of Christ reverses our alienation from God, and as the Word made flesh, Christ's very person assures us that at the deepest level of our being, we are not alienated from the world. The incarnation demonstrates the interconnectedness between the divine and the human, the eternal and the temporal, between heaven and earth. The incarnation thus challenges all the dualisms of ancient and modern Gnosticisms. The Enlightenment promoted an ideal of detached knowledge, which produced a severe sense of alienation from creation. It thus planted the seeds for a devaluing of art and imagination. But from the standpoint of Christian belief, this alienating account misrepresents our nature and the nature of creation. It's out of keeping with the biblical account of the kinds of creatures we are and the kind of world that God has placed us in. As Gunton put it, we stand neither God-like over the material world, as the rationalism of the Enlightenment has encouraged us to think, nor are we at the mercy of something utterly different and incomprehensible, as some forms of existentialist reaction may suggest. We can know the world, though not infallibly, nor with an aim at a kind of omniscience, because we are both part of it and able to transcend it through our powers of perception, imagination, and reason. And perception, imagination, reason come together perhaps most intensely in artistic modes of knowledge and of expression. Art presupposes a coherence and intelligibility in creation, even when artists explicitly deny creation those qualities. Art works because the world is a creation, not simply a meaningless cosmic accident. Even people who believe that the world is the product of chance often cannot help, when they work creatively, to behave otherwise. Reality always gets the last word. Imaginative expressions in the visual arts, in poetry and music, have existential power because at some level they convey to us something about the coherence, the various connections and likenesses that God has placed in creation. This idea came up in a conversation I enjoyed years ago with Richard Wilbur, who is one of the greatest of 20th century American poets. And Wilbur said in this interview that the centrality of metaphor in poetry, quote, puts almost every poet in danger of being religious. If anything, this is Wilbur's words, if anything may be compared to anything else, if the world can be seen as a linkage of similes and metaphors and figures, then poetry itself comes very close to declaring that all things are co-natural, that is, that they are all of one nature. And that brings you to the threshold of saying that all things have had a maker. And then he reported, this is one of my favorite moments in many years of doing interviews. He said, I remember ages ago reading the final book of poems by Joseph Warren Beach, who claimed to be an atheist. And I took it around to him. He was in Cambridge at that time, Cambridge, Mass. And I said, Joseph, look at these two lines. Don't you think that they amount to a religious affirmation? And he read them and he said, well, I can see that they do. I must say I seem simply to have submitted to the spirit of poetry at that moment. It is an awesome thing to submit to the spirit of poetry even for a moment. This capacity for imagination to recognize, not to assert, but to recognize likenesses within a coherent creation, which is the essence of so much of the wisdom literature, where particularly Solomon's Proverbs, where one thing is compared to another. In the Psalms, we see this all the time. I often like to say that Psalm 1, in which the righteous man is compared to a tree by streams of waters that yields its fruit in its season, its leaf does not wither. That when God created trees, he had that metaphor in mind. This is not something that comes late. It's not that some clever person figured, hey, a righteous person is kind of like a tree. When God creates the way trees work and the way righteousness works, that likeness is present in the reality of creation. I think that's assumed in the way poetry works, and the reason why wisdom literature is poetry and not bullet points. I want to spend a few minutes looking at the way in which one mid-20th century philosopher of art described this capacity to make connections between the inner world and the world of material form. Suzanne Langer, who lived between 1895 and 1985, developed a theory of art that challenged the dualism between objective and subjective. In her anthology, Problems of Art, Langer argued, quote, "A work of art is a perceptible form that expresses the nature of true feeling, the rhythms and connections, crises and breaks, the complexity and richness of what is sometimes called man's inner life, the stream of direct experience, life as it feels to the living." She went on to say, what we call a person's inner life is the inside story of his own history, the way living in the world feels to him. This kind of experience is usually but vaguely known because most of its components are nameless, and no matter how keen our experience may be, it's hard to form an idea of anything that has no name. It has no handle for the mind. This has led many learned people to believe that feeling is a formless affair, that it has causes which may be determined, effects that have to be dealt with, but in itself it's irrational. It's a disturbance in the organism with no structure of its own. And yet, subjective existence has a structure to it. It can be conceptually known, it can be reflected on, imagined, and symbolically expressed in detail and to great depth. Only it's not our usual medium of discourse, communication by language, that serves to express what we know of the life of feeling. There are logical reasons why language fails to meet this purpose. What language does not readily do, present the nature and patterns of sensitive and emotional life, is done by works of art. Such works are expressive forms, and what they express is the nature of human feeling. Close quote. Langer was confident that forms of material expression could adequately, meaningfully, and reliably convey the most elusive aspects of our deepest life. In reading Langer not long ago, I was reminded of a scene in the movie Girl with a Pearl Earring. And in the story, a young servant girl has come to work in the home of the painter Jan Vermeer, and Vermeer sees something in her face that he wants to capture on canvas. And after he's painted her, a project concerning which she's not altogether comfortable coming from a strict Calvinist family, when she first glimpses the portrait, she gasps and says, "You looked inside me." Langer describes the formal depiction of inner life. She quotes a psychologist who'd also been trained in music, who said, "Music sounds as feelings feel." And likewise, she continues, in good painting, sculpture, or building, balanced shapes and colors, lines and masses look as emotions, vital tensions, and their resolutions feel. Now, this doesn't mean that we need to translate a painting or a sonata into words, into conceptual language, in order for the work of art to do its work. She says, no, a work of art is an expressive form and therefore a symbol, but not a symbol which points beyond itself so that one's thought points to a concept. The idea remains bound up in the form that makes it conceivable. This is a universal testimony that I think it was Schubert who had written a new etude and played it for some friends, and someone asked him about the meaning of the etude, and he sat down and played it again. The meaning is in the work. Similarly, Flannery O'Connor talks about people who read a short story and ask for the meaning of the story, as if, she says, the story is a big barrel that you can kind of reach down and pull out the meaning and extract it from the story. No, the story is its meaning. It's not something that's reducible. We can talk about it, but it's not finally reducible to conceptualization. I like Langer's perspective as far as it goes. I think I've been stressing initially the meaningfulness and intelligibility of creation. But we are within creation, and there's a meaningfulness and intelligibility even of the subtlest kinds of feelings we have. I would recommend you try to track down online. There are PDF copies of it. George MacDonald has a wonderful essay on the nature of imagination, in which he basically says something very similar to Langer. He says when we have some feeling we can't put into words, or some deep thought we can't put into words, try to do it, and we look around and we see that God has already placed in creation something that works metaphorically to convey some inner state, that God has already anticipated our desire to express this inner reality in some communicable way. Words may fail us, but creation doesn't fail us, because the intelligibility of creation resonates with the intelligibility of our own inner life. As I say, I like Langer as far as she goes. She challenges the assumption of this impermeable barrier between matter and meaning, between inner life and outer life. Her ideas remind me of a conversation I once had with portrait painter Kathy Prescott. And Kathy said, "I'm always interested in painting what's interior." I think every portrait painter would be. How do you get at that? She asked herself. What are you going to do to portray what you see is expressive in them? She says, it's not self-expressing. I'm not expressing myself when I paint them. I am connecting with something that they express, and I'm interested in trying to put that into an image. And Prescott believes that painting can capture faithfully something of inner realities in a person's life, but that requires that she be deeply attentive to her subjects. She takes many, many photographs of her subjects. She studies them. She engages them in conversation. She watches for how they frown and what makes them frown. She watches how their body moves when they ask a question, how they smile or laugh. And her habits of attentiveness informs the way she lives. She said, I'm one of those people wired to notice these kinds of things. I'm not really good in committees. Because instead of listening to the content of what they're saying, I'm watching the expression on their face and every movement of their shoulder and their neck. I'm watching them turn their head. I'm watching that eyebrow go up for a particular reason. It occurs to me she might be really good playing poker. I don't know. I'm interested in what makes them tick and what's behind that. And all of those details are of extreme interest to me. And I ask her if all those details are meaningful. Aren't some of them simply arbitrary or capricious? She said, never. They're all meaningful. The inner life of the human being takes shape in our bodies, which can take shape in portraits. And I want to go still further. Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, in his book Grace and Necessity, made the claim that the artistic, quote, represents the communion between the inner life of the objects of the world and the human self. The inner life of the objects of the world. Tree hugger. Williams's book is a deeply sympathetic exploration of some of the thinking about aesthetics that was developed by Jacques Maritain, who was one of the most significant influences on the thinking of Flannery O'Connor. And in Maritain's Christian realism, the idea of inward meaning isn't limited to the realm of human feeling. The things of creation have an inward meaning. They're not simply meaningless raw material. They are God-formed and God-placed. And so creation can be properly perceived as an epiphany. The heavens declare the glory of God. God's eternal power and divine nature can be perceived in things he has made. Throughout the scriptures, especially in the wisdom literature and the Psalms, creation is depicted as an active and evident witness to God's identity. And it bears witness in a chorus of worship. In Psalm 89, we read that the very heavens shall praise thy wondrous works and thy truth in the congregation of the saints. The heavens and the earth are depicted as testifying to God's nature, to his works in history, and to his coming triumph over evil. In Psalm 96, we read, let the heavens be glad, let the earth rejoice, let the sea roar and all that fills it. Let the field exult and everything in it. Then shall all the trees of the forest sing for joy. Before the Lord, for he comes to judge the earth. He will judge the world in righteousness and the people in his faithfulness. Creation bears witness that those with ears to hear will hear. But to hear, they must approach creation with a well-ordered imagination. In Gerard Manley Hopkins' wonderful poem, God's Grandeur, and I mean wonderful in its strict sense, it's full of wonder, he begins by insisting the world is charged with the grandeur of God, and with all that double entendre that the word charged means. He goes on to suggest that modern men and women fail to perceive the authoritative revelation offered in nature because we're so preoccupied with practical matters. All is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. Where the scriptures present creation as an epiphany, modern culture and many modern Christians see creation just as a pile of raw materials, natural resources, inert, meaningless stuff awaiting our creativity. The world is commonly regarded as material to which we do something, not a source from which we receive something. And I want to suggest that this receptive posture toward creation is contrary to how we should pursue the arts, as well as to how we position ourselves in worship. Our worship should recognize that God, the maker of all things, reveals himself in what he has made, and that he calls us toward a receptive and grateful posture toward creation. That is the posture also of artists. Both worship and the arts serve the function of reorienting our minds, imaginations, and practices so that we can properly perceive what creation is and what our place in creation is. But we won't perceive the revelatory power of creation unless we approach creation with imaginations properly tuned. Remember what George Parkin Grant says, that we should approach with a spirit of wonder or marveling or admiring rather than asking, what can we do with this? Art is a way of admiring and engaging a meaningful and wonderful creation. God presents us in creation with materials and forms that artists transform, but they're always tethered to some order implicit in creation. Theologian Peter Leithart has observed the artist is always transforming, but this transformation is an attempt to get at dimensions of what's really there, not an abandonment of what's really there, even if the artist is aiming at fantasy. Art attempts to highlight patterns, correspondences, dimensions to reality that are usually missed in our everyday experience, and to force us to look again at the sunflower or the pipe or the chair. As the Russian formalists say, one of the purposes of art is to defamiliarize the familiar for the point of seeing it as it really is. The artist is always responding to the reality of creation in some way, even in the most abstract of artistic forms. And the best artists are open to receiving something from creation before they transfigure it. An artist has to sense creation with an exceptional acuity. Catholic philosopher Josef Pieper, in a little book called Only the Lover Sings, subtitled Art and Contemplation, observes that to contemplate means, first of all, to see, not to think. A kind of seeing that is receptive and open, not just accurate. Now, of course, when I say that the artist perceives creation, I don't just mean trees and birds and sunsets, but what we might call the components of creation, colors and shapes and sounds and textures, as well as the human activities within creation, the way our bodies inhabit space and time, the way words work with all of their intriguing textures and resonances, and the shape of inner life, of sorrow, of memory, of grief, and affection. All of the aspects of nature and human nature have to be attended to lovingly and then reassembled, reconfigured, remixed. Human creativity is never creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. It's always creative creation out of something, a something that God has already blessed with meaning. When our thinking as Christians, while our thinking as Christians may be suspicious about the goodness of creation sometimes, Christian worship is always inescapably involved imaginatively with the stuff of creation. The poetry of the Psalms was recited by our Lord and his disciples. Music was a part of Christian worship since choirs of angels greeted the nativity of the incarnate Christ, possibly earlier, whether Mary sang her remarkable song inspired by her miraculous pregnancy or simply spoke them, we don't know, but it's still sung week after week in churches around the world. and artful expressions in worship have been present in less obvious ways. It's notable that the communion table contains bread and wine, not wheat and grapes. It's not organic material in its most natural state that serves as a memorial meal uniting us with God. Bread and wine are the products of human creativity, not simply of God's blessing of the harvest. Even grain and grapes require attentive care to bring them to fruition. And wine is an even more artful product. Bread demands attentiveness to all the many details of creation. Bakers and vintners aren't people we usually think of as people involved in the arts, but the work that they do has a lot in common with the work artists do. They take the stuff of creation, transform it into something delightful and beautiful. Bread and wine and art can all serve practical purposes, but they often go beyond necessity toward delight. And Lightheart observes that, quote, art is a making that imitates the making of God, and it is most godlike when it is purely gratuitous, when it is not meeting a need. And this reminds us, of course, that all of creation is gratuitous. God didn't need to make the creation. Creation is not something God needed to do, but we rejoice and give thanks both in worship and in our experience of the arts that he chose to. In worship, we honor the Creator for the gift of creation and of salvation. In works of art, we imitate God's act of delighted and gratuitous making. And in the Lord's Supper, we receive a great feast, a table set for us not because we deserve it, or even just because we need it. God's salvation could have been less extravagant, more perfunctory than a feast. Just as the wine that Jesus made from water could have been merely passable rather than notably fine. The gifts that God gives are given generously as well as gratuitously. When we receive a great gift, we're delighted in the gift and in the generosity of the giver, and so it is with the reception of a powerful work of art. When I hear a thoughtful and attentive performance of a carefully crafted piece of music, or when I watch a masterfully constructed film, I often have that sense of gratitude, not just to the performers and the composer or director, but to God, grateful to live in a world where such joys are possible. The gratitude felt by the recipients of a gift resonates with the delight known by the giver of the gift. And that's a pattern built into creation. Since creation is the work of a dynamic three-personed God, and the members of the Trinity enjoy among themselves an eternal giving and receiving. The doctrine of the Trinity reminds us of the personality and dynamism of God, qualities that are suggested in the ancient term applied to the Trinity, perichoresis, which refers to the mutual indwelling of the persons of the Trinity. By extension, it refers to God's relationship to the world, whereby everything is in him and he is in some way in everything. The core in perichoresis shows up in our word choreography, and perichoresis suggests that the relationship among the persons of the Trinity is like a dance. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are dancing around each other, and the Christian life, which involves God in us and we in God, is our entry into that dance. Artistic, imaginative, creative activity is thus not a pleasant and rewarding ornament that we might use to decorate our lives or to make them less boring. Artistic activity is evidence to us of the kinds of creatures we are, the kind of creator that God is, and the kind of world in which he's placed us to love and serve him as we exercise our stewardship over it. Christians whose lives are indifferent to forms of imaginative expression, or whose imaginations have not been trained to be attentive and receptive and grateful to forms of artistic meaning, might run the risk of reducing the gospel to mere personal therapy, when the gospel really is cosmic. The scale of the Christian story incorporates the intensely intimate and the vast incomprehensibles of the cosmos. And we need works of imagination to convey the whole story to us, to refresh our gratitude to God, to reorient our engagement with all that he has made, and to baptize our imaginations. Art that resonates with the order in creation conveys to us a deeper sense of the character of our Creator. I want to close with a powerful affirmation of God's faithfulness and a wonderful picture of the hospitable intelligibility of creation. The meaningfulness of creation is not just a detached meaningfulness. I like to think of it in terms of its hospitableness. And this is from Isaiah 45. This is this wonderful little, almost a little parenthetic passage. For thus says Yahweh, the creator of the heavens, he is God who shaped the earth and made it, who set it firm. He did not create it to be chaos. He formed it to be lived in. I am Yahweh and there is no other. I have not spoken in secret in some dark corner of the underworld. I did not say, offspring of Jacob, search for me in chaos. I am Yahweh. I proclaim saving justice. I say what is true. Thank you very much. Should we sit here? Yeah.
All right, thank you. We're going to spend a few moments taking questions. And if you're interested in asking a question, we're going to ask that you just raise your hand, and we have some microphones that will be run to you.
I'm going to misquote you, but you said something to the effect that art was taking the stuff of creation and transforming it into something beautiful. Perhaps this is a odd view of art, but could I not therefore include both mathematics and science properly envisioned as art?
Well, I mean, yeah, you could say that, and I'm not sure. One could say that, and it could advance certain purposes. Interesting thing. I mean, obvious mathematics. Actually, there's a really interesting book by Edward Rothstein on mathematics and music, and where he looks at what makes an equation beautiful and what makes, say, a sonata beautiful. And it came out about 20 years ago or so. I can't remember the title of it, I'm sorry. But Edward Rothstein was, I think he was music critic of the New York Times at one time, but he obviously knows a lot more math than I do. And so there is a beauty there. I don't know that, art, there's a sense in which art is a social institution. Art may not be a natural kind. And so for the sake of differentiating between various disciplines, calling mathematics or scientific work art may not help us. But we'd certainly want to see kinships that are present. And if we weren't as committed as we are, I think, as a culture, to the kind of divorce between utility and beauty, or if we didn't think that the principal work of science was not to perceive the meaning of things, but to give us mechanisms of control. That's where I think that if we thought that the work of science was like pre-modern natural philosophy or natural history, where it revealed things about the nature of creation, not for the sake of our controlling things, but for the sake of our perceiving and knowing things and wondering and amazing at them. So, art, I just did an interview not long ago. Peter Harrison, who teaches in Australia, gave the Gifford lectures, I think 2 or 3 years ago, called The Territories of Science and Religion, in which he demonstrated that the word science and what we think of as the sciences, or what we think of as science, is really a relatively new definition. And what we think of as religion is also relatively new. So, and what we think of as art is relatively new. So, I mean, all these things are, in some measure, they're socially situated. And so I didn't mean to be snarky and say you could do that. I want to ask, well, what are we trying to accomplish in doing that? Because I think the way we define these words and the way we set their boundaries, the way we define their territories, does matter. And so I think that, I certainly don't want to. I will reiterate what C.S. Lewis says in The Abolition of Man. Towards the end of Abolition of Man, he said, many people will perceive this book as as an attack on science as such. And I certainly don't want to make it sound like that I'm attacking science as such, because of the philosophical ideas that accompanied the development of modern science. I don't know if that answers your question. Good.
Is this on now? Okay, good. So God is invisible. He's a spirit, doesn't have a body. And even in the incarnation, if we're going to be Chalcedonian about it, we need to make a distinction between Christ's divine and human nature. So my question is there a sense in which to know God, we have to move beyond the aesthetic? That we have to leave behind the sensible? And in that sense, is there some sense in which there's a good dualism in terms of the creator-creature distinction that we have to keep in mind? And going along with that, does that mean, is there a danger in overvaluing the aesthetic too much to the point that, I'm reading a lot of German idealists right now, and kind of...
Who are you reading? I'm sorry.
a lot of German idealists, Hegel, that sort of thing. And one of the ideas you see is that, well, if God's going to really become concrete for us, then you're going to have some kind of pantheism. There's a danger that you want to make God sensible because the sensible is so important. And I just wonder, how should we navigate that?
See, it's interesting that you say leave behind the aesthetic, because it seems to me that the aesthetic is precisely a kind of connecting, and that's implied in the quote I had from D.C. Schindler, that aesthetic experience is actually where the material and the spiritual meet. And I think there's something to that. It's where the unless you regard all of matter as merely matter, as mere matter that has no spiritual significance, or whose significance is imposed or read after the fact. I mean, that's one way of thinking of the material world, that the material world has no inherent, that it has nothing that transcends its measurable characteristics. Nothing beyond that. There's a line in Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis that I've been quoting a lot lately, where Eustace, that bratty little Eustace, this is when Eustace is still really bratty, and he meets this figure named Ramandu, who informs him that he was a star, and now he has a human form. And Ramandu says, very skeptically, in my world, a star is just a ball of flaming gas. And Ramandu says to him, my son, in your world, that is only what a star is made of, not what a star is. And Lewis doesn't go on and describe that. But so the question is the aesthetic the way we can actually perceive the isness of things, the whatness of things that goes beyond their mere materiality? And you're reading the German idealists. I've been reading a lot of the Nouvelle Theologie theologians, and there's some common concerns that they have, clearly. But and I'd want to ask provocatively, if we take St. Paul's affirmation that in him we live and move and have our being, and that he's not far from us, is there some way in which we perceive things that are transcendent in the material world? And the aesthetic is the way, as opposed to, say, the scientific, if I is or the merely mathematical. Well, maybe I won't even go that far. The aesthetic is the capacity that enables us to avoid reducing stars to mere balls of flaming gas. The aesthetic is and imagination is the means whereby an inherent meaningfulness in things is perceptible. And that's not, the way you said to leave behind the aesthetic to know God, that seems to presuppose that the aesthetic is kind of trapped in this immanent world, and I'm questioning that.
I'm just wondering what effect do you think it had on Protestant America that the reformers were so uneasy with art because the religious art they thought promoted idolatry and they scraped it off all the walls of the churches? Yeah. That seems to be a fairly major factor that would transcend Protestants from Europe to America.
Yeah. Well, in this 500th anniversary of the Reformation, I don't want to diss the reformers. I think that there are, if I can rely on C.S. Lewis again, Lewis, in talking about the untoward effects of modern science and its preoccupation with control as it's developed, he says it may be too much to say that science was malformed from the beginning, but science was born at an inauspicious hour in a bad neighborhood. And I've long wondered, even when I was in seminary at one of our most Protestant of seminaries, Westminster, what was it about the mentality of the 17th century? Were there blind spots or preoccupations in the 17th century? This is the century of Descartes and Bacon and other people who promote a kind of reductionism. The foundations they lay are some very bad things are built on those foundations. And so I think that we do need to ask. I think it was R.C. Sproul who said even the best theologians are usually maybe right 75 to 80% of the time. So, and R.C.'s always right, so I can go rid of that. So he must be right about that. No, I think it's worth asking, and a lot of theologians have asked that. The other thing is that there are, I just was reading a review of a book by a Reformed theologian named Belden Lane, who's definitely more liberal than I am, but he's looking at Calvin and Edwards and looking at support for a really, well, you certainly see it in Edwards. There's a strong commitment to beauty in Edwards. He says beauty is kind of the overarching attribute of God. So I think there are aspects of the Reformers' concerns that became amplified in subsequent decades and centuries, which probably had the untoward effect that you're talking about and created the kind of suspicion. I think that the practicality that Robert Hughes talks about, I think that particularly Anglo-American culture has always had, English culture has a strong utilitarian practical bent to it more than a lot of other cultures do. So the spirit of the British practicality and does inhabit a lot of American tendencies, dispositions. So I think that, there is. I think one of the other attributes that we should look at is there is a suspicion of ritual among many of the reformers. But as a friend of mine said, they were criticizing ritual as magic, not ritual as a language. And there's a difference between ritual as magic and ritual as a language. And it turns out that art is almost always ritualistic in some way, that it uses forms in some way that is like what ritual is. And so to be suspicious of ritual as magic doesn't require you to dispense with an appreciation for how form and how the repeated use of forms is actually essential to human communication. And that's a distinction that unfortunately, it's a distinction that subsequent Reformed theologians have recognized, and I think it's a welcome recognition. Semper reformanda, I always say. Thank you.
Yeah. Good. Other questions?
Just thinking about what you said earlier when you summarized Paul, that we have our being in God, and what you had to say about the incarnation, but also describing art as a social institution. I'm wondering if you view art as having its origins in God and then being construed or misconstrued by the individual, or if art has its origins in the individual and then is developed from that individual's view or construction of reality.
Yeah. Well, in the essay that I mentioned by George MacDonald, and it's called something like On the Care and Cultivation of Imagination. It's in a collection called A Dish of Orts, O-R-T-S. Orts is a Gaelic term meaning leftovers. And there was a collection of essays by MacDonald that were published that he rather fancifully called leftovers. And there's this essay on imagination. And he basically says that God imagines creation into being. That the work of creation is a work not just of making, but a work of imagining. And so he argues that part of the Imago Dei, I think he uses that language, but that we like God are imaginers of things. And we have and that can be everything from landscaping your yard to painting the Mona Lisa. That we have a mental image of what a thing could be, and the mental image need not be merely utilitarian. It need not just solve a practical problem, and often our image of what our yard could look like is more beautiful than it actually turns out to be. So I think that art, what we call art, again, I'm sensitive to the fact that that word hasn't always been used to describe the things that we use to describe it. That forms of creative expression are, and the human capacity for and drive to pursue those, it does reflect something of the image of God in us. Even to use the language of image already implies imagination.
Good. Other questions up here?
Hi, I just wanted to, early on you spoke about how as Americans we often support art, that if we do support art, it often has some sort of utilitarian purpose to it, with the suggestion, at least as I understood it, that that's sort of an inferior way to experience art or to appreciate art. But what about decorative arts or the shaker aesthetic, that the things that we have that are useful should be beautiful and beautiful should be useful, or Japanese tea ceremony, or things like that dignify the ordinary?
Yeah.
Is there value? Is that an inferior experience of art, or is that equally valuable?
No, that's a great question, because it really gets, I'm sorry, did I interrupt you? I'm sorry. Yeah, it gets at I think there's that one of the false dualisms I want to question is beauty and utility. So to say that something is done, to say that beauty is, that we'll do something and then we'll add beauty as a kind of afterthought, rather than the beauty of the thing actually being part of the accomplishing of the thing. I've talked to Mako Fujimura about the Japanese tea ceremony, and it's not something you could do without it having the beauty that is attached to it. I actually picked up there on Dorothy L. Sayers. She said that to view art, either to denounce the art or to just see them in a moralistic sense, is false and degrading to the kind of thing art is. But the idea that as you say, the decorative arts that accompany practical things, but aren't that we don't surrender all practices to mere efficiency. That sheer efficiency is never enough for us, and actually it actually belies the. I would say one of the reasons it's not enough is because of the fact that our lives should be characterized by gratitude, and because everything we have is a gift. And so one of the things that I think the making beautiful of things that could be merely practical or efficient, one of the things it accomplishes is I talked here about how when you encounter a great work of art, or even a simple work of art that's thoughtful, that gratitude is a natural response to it. So I would say that occasions to actually augment and multiply the occasions for gratitude is a wonderful thing to have, and a society that nurtures that. I think of, with regard to food, I've done a lot of interviews about how we treat food and how we treat meals, how we present meals. And the best meals are presented with an attentiveness to all of the possibility of beautiful detail. The garnish. Rather than treating food just as fuel. In fact, I think that one of the reasons why we're created as creatures who need to eat in order to live, rather than having a kind of self-sufficiency. I mean, I sometimes imagine we could have photosynthetic skin and just kind of absorb energy. And surely there were other things God could have done in the design. But in the scriptures, God's provision of food for his creatures, I think, is the number one instance of his providence and an occasion for gratitude. So if that's what meals are there for, then we shouldn't treat meals in a purely utilitarian, non-artistic way. Those of us of a certain age are remembering Edith Schaefer's hidden art at this point in the conversation, which probably predates many of you here. But she, in the 60s or 70s, was talking about meals and candles and things. So, thank you. That's a very good question.
All right. I think we have time for one more.
I'm going to wedge two questions into this one, if I can. You can take whichever you want. I'm curious to know if you're optimistic or pessimistic in your survey of current culture about the role of Christian artistic expression, and if you would have answered that differently 20 or 30 years ago. And secondly, if you think the primary purpose of Christian artistic expression is the edification of the church and the enlargement of the Christian imagination, or the instruction of the world, something like pre-evangelism, or if that's kind of a false dichotomy, if the subject and the audience are just the human.
Yeah, I think I can, oddly enough, I think I can answer both those quickly, which is rare. I'm much more optimistic. Or let's say I'm even if I'm pessimistic, I'm hopeful.
Dispositionally.
No, I'm actually, because I think, as I alluded in the talk, the work that's been done by really serious thinkers, dozens and dozens of people, to address the very thing that Dorothy L. Sayers said in that introductory essay, that we're not thinking about art in a Trinitarian and incarnational way. The work that's been done since then is wonderful. Now the question is, when will it trickle down into the lives of the average layperson in the average congregation? And that actually does address your second question, because I think that a lot of the church's appropriation of forms of creative expression is done for utilitarian evangelistic purposes, that it's done basically as a marketing scheme. And so it's done for promoting an image not for being something. And I have said for years, when I talk about the church and cultural life, let's do a thought experiment. Let's imagine Jesus returns tomorrow. And then what do we do on Monday about our cultural life? How do we make decisions about cultural life, assuming that evangelism is now off the table? Okay? Now, most people have no idea how they would think about that, I think, because we're so enmeshed in the idea that that evangelism is, in a sense, the only task of the church. And I would say that that we are the church for the sake of the world. We are the people of God, so that we can participate in the coming of the kingdom and in the sharing of the good news. But the good news is about what God is doing for His people. The good news is about the church, that He's bringing people unto Himself, and who have abundant life, who have a rich life that actually is consistent with the kinds of creatures that we're made to be. So it seems to me that again, the question of mission versus communal identity, again, I don't want to split those either. That unless we have a way of life in the life of the church that actually reflects all that redemption means in all of its components, then it seems then what evangelism is just punching people's ticket to get to heaven. Evangelism is not bringing them into an abundant life now as well as into eternity. So,
thank you.
Thank you.
Let me ask you to join me in thanking Ken one more time for being here.